Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Institute of Place Management and Regional Studies Association webinar, which is the first of a new series that we will be doing as part of a collaboration over the next 6 to 12 months as we strengthen the relationships between the two organisations. For those that don't know me, my name is Ian Harvey, and I'm the head of the Institute of Place Management, and I will chair the session over the next hour. I am delighted that there's the running order. We will finish promptly for 1 p.m, but over the next hour or so, I'm delighted to be joined by some of my colleagues from Manchester Metropolitan University as we discuss POPs, otherwise known as privately owned public spaces, which builds on a recent paper that my colleagues, Dr Nikos and Ntounis, Dr Jenny Kanellopoulou and Professor Steve Millington have recently published. And we look forward to hearing some perspectives and discussion points from Dr. Lee from the University of Dortmund. And here are the faces on the screen for you to sort of see who will be keeping us company as we hear their perspectives over the next hour. This webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly on the RSA and Institute of Place Management website. And it really is the start of building on a collaboration between the two organisations over the past couple of years. I joined the Institute of Place Management at the start of the year in January, and in conversations with colleagues sort of here at Manchester Metropolitan University, I asked who are the partners, who are the other organisations, who are the other institutes that we should have a closer relationship with and closer collaboration. And the RSA came back in several conversations. So over the past 6 to 7 months, we've been strengthening that relationship. My colleagues Jenny and Nikos went to Porto, and sort of there they are with Alan. We recently hosted Tom Merriweather in sort of our office, and there's a news article on the RSA website. But this sort of recent collaboration and the launch of this webinar series builds on from our sort of conversations and collaborations that colleagues such as Professor Steve Millington and sort of Dr. Nikos and Ntounis have been doing over the past sort of 3 to 5 years, who have been really eager for IPM and RSA to have a closer collaboration, and that's what we are sort of hopefully doing today. So who are we? Who are the IPM and who are the RSA? So the RSA, the Regional Studies Association, is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional development and research, and supports its members with latest research, funding schemes, networking and publishing opportunities and spaces to grow research and careers. We, the Institute of Place Management, we're the global professional network for anyone who wants to make places better, whether that's working in a town centre, whether that's working for a health body, sort of wanting to sort of reduce health inequalities. And we're based here at Manchester Metropolitan University, and we are very much focused on research, education and knowledge exchange. And we are hoping through this relationship between the two organisations, we can strengthen our networks and we can sort of have more of that global knowledge exchange. And we start this new partnership with today, building on recent work from my colleagues, Steve, Nikos and Jenny, who have published a paper called Managing and Navigating Manchester's Privately Owned Public Spaces, Understanding Publicness. This research offers a plural property perspective, recognising that managing public space is really black and white. By applying the tools of legal geography, the study highlights how day-to-day decisions about signage, access, behaviour and maintenance shape how inclusive, accessible and truly public spaces these feel. In this session, we will discuss practical challenges and solutions around POPs, ownership and urban governance, such as what POPs are and why they matter, how legal geography helps us understand public and private boundaries. We will have a case study with my colleague Steve Millington, specifically looking at Manchester, and we will have practical insights for working with private owners and stakeholders. This is a collaboration between IPM and RSA, but we want for the next hour to be a collaboration with people on the call as well. So please use the chat function to sort of pick up comments as the presentations go along. And please also sort of use the Q&A function. And when we get to the sort of the final 10 to 15 minutes, I will sort of come back into the session and I will ask the participants and sort of the panelists some sort of questions that you prompt. So please do feel free to sort of say who you are, where you're from, and also sort of some questions for our panelists. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to my colleague, Dr. Nikos Ntounis. Hopefully Nikos is there.
Yep.
Nikos is a senior lecturer in the Department of Marketing, International Business and Tourism at Manchester Met University and a researcher at the Institute of Place Management. His research focuses on the management of places and on alternative approaches of place branding, placemaking, governance, and leadership within the urban environment, with a particular emphasis on squatted areas and privately owned public spaces. He is the managing editor of the Journal of Place Management and Development. Welcome, Nikos.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the attendees as well for joining us in this first, Institute of Place Management and Regional Studies Association webinar. So, yeah, as Ian explained earlier, myself, Jenny, who you'll see in a bit, and Steve have actually doing some research on privately owned public spaces for a while now, at least a couple of years, and we put this on a paper to further explain the role of place management, in the actual organization and daily operation of these areas. So next slide, Ian. So what we did with what we did as an approach was designing a workshop with the help of the managing company in Manchester, Cityco, to actually bring together asset managers and estate managers of the privately owned public spaces and explain to them how place management can work with it. So our approach sits in the middle of the four pillars of the IPM: repositioning, rebranding, restructuring, and reinventing. And our approaches are such as 25 priorities of high street chains sits in the middle of the argument between Pope's notions of open city forms, like Lisa Sennett's open city, and Jane Jacobs' quality of the street, which we draw from geography and sociology, and also on the other spectrum, the notions of underpinning frameworks from law together with existing practice, or such as London's public space charter. So this is where our research and our approach of engaged scholarship sits. So we brought together a collaborative approach and convene workshops with these POPs managers to not critique from the outside, but to co-create an understanding from within to reframe POPs management as collaborative rather than controlling. Next slide, please, Ian. So we asked 3 questions, and we structured the workshops around these 3 provocations. And you can see also in this slide who attended these workshops. So basically, we asked who defines public in POPs, and with that we kind of try to establish the principles of publicness. What does good stewardship look like? In that part, we're trying to we made the estate managers in the workshop to respond to scenarios as interactive group exercises with the background of the critical reflection on POPs. And the third one was basically how can POPs be more accountable to place, leading to that discussion of how we can help towards designing maybe a charter in Manchester as well, and bringing all these benchmarks of good public space into the discussion of managing privately owned public space. Managers engage very candidly in this and shared operational dilemmas, and their concerns basically based on good public realm and with themes of accessibility, inclusivity, safety and comfort, pleasurable activities and meaningful activities like coming a lot into the fourth, and it is and if you read in the paper, you'll see that the estate manager's perception of a good public space is what the literature suggests that a good public space should look like framework-wise. Next slide, Ian. So this is just basically to explain why we're talking about privately owned public space. And the discussion, of course, starts in 1961 in the zoning resolution in New York City, which allowed open public space in dense area, encouraged open public space in dense areas by offering developers the incentives to create plazas or arcades. So this was very prevalent, as you can see, in New York, and that map shows exactly, how Manhattan's urban core, for example, and Brooklyn's and Queens expanded into creating this idea of notion of privately owned public space. And next slide here. And this is the map of Manchester's privately owned public spaces so far. So we used that recently in a recent mapping exercise and work that we did with some delegates from Nigeria. Actually, were interested in this work, and you can see that around the urban core of Manchester, there is a lot of these spaces are actually popping in, and this is testament to the recent developments in Manchester and the recent urban regeneration that is happening in the city. Next slide here. So just to explain really exactly what we talk with public space creation, Cohen and Warda, in their book The Hidden Wealth of Cities, which is, I think, open access anyway, they put the perspective there of how the definition has evolved, and they basically highlight different types of ownership and management that define what a privately owned public space is. So you can see here that what we're talking about is something that is implemented by the private sector. It's owned also, it's privately owned and privately managed, but has a public user access. So this is where the discussion on privately owned public space is framed. Next slide, Ian. And of course, in the UK, this is not a recent phenomenon. And in 2017, for example, The Guardian has, this title has actually revealed the extent of pseudo public spaces, especially in London, and how details of the upcoming development plans will include this space in the future. So obviously there were a lot of questions behind that of local citizens, and at the time when local authorities were asked about details of these spaces, only two, Cardiff and Cambridge, were able to actually give details on those. So of course we have come we've come a long way from this right now, and we have more information about these spaces, but it's still a problem that is defined. It's defined like problems. Next slide here. And the problem, especially if you put in Richard Sennett's words, is about what they call in his book with Pablo Centra caging. So this is when inflexible planning, elimination of ground control, activation, overregulation of the public realm happens and restricts the spontaneous intermixing of people and cross-fertilization of ideas. So basically, their argument is that these spaces snuff out creativity and opportunities for enterprise and civic society to thrive. Next slide here. The counter argument, though, on that is that we feel, and that's what we state in this paper, in our paper, is that this argument has, whereas valid, has been overstated, mainly because there is an obvious piece of evidence missing, which is that the land in the UK has been privatized, for example, for a long time, and previously public access was restricted in some of these spaces. Instead, we think that some of these spaces have actually opened up new public realm, and private space has become more public, not the other way around, as Carmona also puts it, as publicization of private space. So in order to do that, for Manchester, we thought it was timely to position our paper as a progressive and forward look, as a progressive paper to address the criticism of popes, and also to help the city to establish good standards of public space stewardship. I will now hand over to Jenny, who's just here, so we'll just do a manual hand it over. So there he is.
Hello, thank you, Nikos, and for setting the scene for the work that has been done from the Institute of Place Management before actually my involvement in the project. So when I was involved in the project as the default lawyer of the Institute of Place Management, I came in from the perspective of understanding and applying publicness from the property and public law perspective in the UK. And my initial response was, what public space in the UK? Because obviously the nuances that come with ownership and publicness differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction or from country to country, and something that would be considered as publicly owned place in Europe or in countries with strong constitutional law traditions wouldn't necessarily abide with the rigidness of private ownership of place of property rights in the UK. The UK English law particularly, Scottish is different, operates rigidly against publicness in space, and all rights over land primarily default on exclusion of the public. And this obviously comes from feudal times and the fact that the land is controlled and owned by the crown. So obviously, defining and discussing privately owned public space in the UK context brings all these questions with it, which make essentially a researcher look back and forth over definitions and everything that has to do with the use of the land against a default exclusionary legal standard. So obviously the questions about neoliberalism and offering public space or publicly available space to the population and the visitors of a city remain the same in the US, the UK, and elsewhere in Europe. However, when we are taking on our research hats, trying to navigate these inclusions and property rights and what rights of the public has as opposed to the rights of developers and landowners become a lot more nuanced and difficult to navigate than in any other country in Europe. In that sense, when we were about to actually do the research and write the paper, we needed to find a way to move beyond discussing and regurgitating the default position of the debate over legal ownership. And this is why the legal geography approach became particularly interested and gave us the tools we needed to bring this research to life. Next, Ian, next slide, please. So essentially, when it comes to this particular paper that we are presenting today, we managed, or we tried, and this is something that we offer to the RSA IPM academic community, a way of breaking away from what we coined the public-private ownership debate infinite loop that would have essentially stop our research from going forward. And most recently, this infinite loop and the problems between public and private have found their way in Nicola Chiodelli's and Stefano Moroni's book that was published at the same time as the paper was being written. So we didn't have time to cite it, but we can see that scholarship is moving to that way, that it is necessary to avoid simplistic views based on the romanticization of public spaces per se and the parallel denigration of private spaces per se, as well as on the belief that the public sphere is necessarily and solely connected with public spaces. So we are dealing with nuanced understandings, nuanced definitions, and nuanced layers of regulation and ownership when we're talking about private and public. So our paper particularly builds on three tenets that we are comfortable with as researchers to bring to life. The first one, known to geographers all around, is that we don't and we should not forget to foreground the prosaic and the mundane of the places that we study, because a lot of the solutions and the answers that we seek stem from everyday practices and everyday life. So what is the everyday life in POPs plays a particular role in our research. Secondly, and this comes again from plural property legal geography, we should focus on the public purpose rather than the ownership status of these places to navigate them with a purposeful teleological way. And last but not least, offer a place-based approach, something that obviously RSA research is so well vested in as well, and foreground the notion of place as this is manifested through what constitutes constitutes POPs, essentially this nexus of rights, obligations, and soft policy approaches, either introduced by contract or by memoranda of understanding in these properties. Next slide, please, Ian. So we are offering, as we said, plural property as a methodology to this. Plural property, you can read about it in the paper and in other legal geographic works. However, it comes from the position that there exists no single legal order or legal hierarchy in the way that we appreciate everyday life and a regulation of a place. So based on this perspective and taking this stance, plural property essentially is a way of understanding the day-to-day dynamics by giving a level playing field to all participants and stakeholders in a place without necessarily advancing the rights deriving from property over rights of the public with respect to a particular place. So essentially foregrounding what is essentially that happens there, who is in charge of the place, what responsibilities do they have, and back to the workshops that Nikos explained, how do they understand publicness and what the role should be. And essentially we are adopting instead of an inside-out perspective, an outside-in perspective, being outsiders to these places and looking inside to understand how they operate and how they are constituted as this nexus of rights, obligations, and lived experiences as well. So with this in mind, we embarked on next slide, please, Ian. And based on this knowledge from the workshops and our new methodology in place and our new inquisitive hats on, we embarked on a three-sided walk of Manchester, combining various methodologies such as obviously document analysis, walks, particularly walks with respect to paying attention to regulations and the plurality of laws around us, something that we have worked on in other papers. And the three most prominent sites or most easily accessible sites in Manchester that we chose to investigate are the site of Great Northern, which is a complex in the center of Manchester comprising a Grade 2 listed former railway railhouse that is you can see in the last picture. And the most prominent feature of Great Northern is this amphitheater, the one that says no alcohol to be consumed there. We met with the estate manager who foregrounded his concerns that essentially his job revolves around securing the premises. So the way that this particular estate manager presented his functions with respect to publicness and bringing this public realm to life didn't necessarily touch on visitability, on the experience of the public, or in any rights that the public should have. All he was discussing during our visit was how to safeguard the premises, referring to the actual listed building behind the public realm. So for as far as the experience in this particular amphitheater, which is the plaza, the visited plaza, is concerned, this is surpassed by the estate managers' fears of reliability, making sure that nobody will hurt themselves on the premises, making sure that the building is secure. So essentially the experience of the plaza is shadowed by the experience of the adjacent building, which is about to be knocked down actually, and be replaced by a residential offering. And so will the amphitheater. More about the amphitheater you can read on the paper about this function. Primarily it was supposed to be a music venue that didn't materialize. It was not visited and it became a sandpit where families can go. However, because of this amphitheatrical seating, it is not accessible by anyone. So families cannot actually get there with buggies or prams, or people with disabilities cannot visit. So this particular place, as we say in the paper, is doubly foreclosed, both by materiality, it cannot be visited as a public space, and by regulations such as the non-alcohol consumption sign and the surveillance that takes place in the area, whilst the appreciation of the particular estate manager as what constitutes ownership has nothing to do with the lived experience of visiting a plaza. In our walks, we also visited First Street Manchester, which is a combination of offices. It's an office office complex, also comprising a theatre that is a cultural venue in Manchester. And there we had quite a different experience, because we met with a lot of people responsible for the marketing of this particular place, the estate managers, the security guards. So we can see a lot of activity, but primarily foregrounding a cultural and leisurely offering with respect to the public space there. There was a lot of advertising going on. So essentially what we visited in First Street, Manchester, was a festivalization of the pop, even though obviously surveillance was constant, with an office covertly housed in one of the buildings, and essentially a completely different experience, already marking such a contrast between two things that are both pops, but so different in nature. And last but not least, the middle picture that you have there refers to Mayfield Park, a place for all, as it is marketed in Manchester. It is a 6.5-acre park, which opened in 2022. It is the first park to be opened in Manchester for over 100 years. It has plants and 142 trees. It's reclaimed industrial land. So already we are having a discussion there about the co-option of blue and green infrastructure by urban growth, but also contrasted by the reality of we do need this urban space amidst frenzied redevelopment, because that is the only place that we have. So Mayfield Park, exactly because it is designed as a public space with a public mandate at heart, it is open for all, and it's key with respect to the estate manager. What matters is visitability and the experience of everyone equally, to the effect that even the toilets that were designed next to their playground are accessible for even adults with disabilities. So there's room to change an adult disabled person in these public spaces, toilets as well. There is some commercial activity. There is an ice cream truck there that pays rent. However, this place, exactly because it carries little commercial activity with it, is at the breaking point when it comes to attracting funding. We are waiting for the area around it to be redeveloped, for the park's cost to be covered by the rent paid by the occupants of the surrounding buildings. So essentially this place, even though open and happy and a great place to visit in Manchester, is underpinned by this sense of urgency when it comes to access to funding that is currently at stake. So before I leave the findings to Steve, what I wanted to say from as far as the data collection goes was, in the workshops it was established that asset managers, those in the daily responsibility of POPs, have a vision that abides with literature, as Nikos said, but at the end of the day, the experience vary, both because access to funding and the viability of the place is at stake, or because the offering, the marketization of these places has different target audiences. And now I'm going to pass it on to Steve.
Thank you for that, Jenny. And just before I bring Steve in, I just want to sort of give a little bit of sort of background to Jenny before she sort of jumps straight in, and then I'll bring Steve in. So Jenny is a reader in social legal studies at Manchester Law School and a researcher in the Institute of Place Management, with a particular interest in law and place from a variety of perspectives, including legal geography. Her teaching offers social, legal, and critical approaches to subjects such as intellectual property, law and culture, and law for the creative industries more broadly. And she is a lawyer, non-practicing, with the Athens Bar in Greece. So thank you for that, Jenny. And as you said, Steve will now come in and talk about some of the findings. And Steve Millington is a professor of place management at Manchester Met University and a core member of the Institute Place Management Research Team. He has a background in human geography, and his research focuses on placemaking, including geographies of football, social and cultural practices of illumination, and high street revitalisation. He is the co-editor of two edited collections, Cosmopolitan Urbanism and Spaces of Creativity, Rethinking the Cultural Economy, both published by Routledge. He led the National Placemaking Programme for the High Streets Task Force and is an expert in engaged scholarship research to help communities make places better. And I think Steve will talk to us about some of the findings from the paper. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, and you might want to go through the next slide as well. Yeah, and the next one. There you go. Right. Yeah, I've got but 4 things to talk about. And I would say this as a professor of place management. Place management is crucial to understanding how POPs managers navigate the complexities of publicness. By focusing on overlooked prosaic operational practices, the research highlights the important role estate managers play in foregrounding the everyday and mundane in the regulatory lived managerial and experiential dimensions of these spaces. So our outside-in approach reveals POPs custodians are embroiled in safeguarding the lived dimensions of publicness, which include accessibility, unplanned activity, sociability, and inclusiveness. These attributes align with the estate manager's own definitions of what makes good public space. Yet estate managers are constantly perform a balancing act within the hyperlocal governance ecosystem, negotiating and engaging dialogue to sustain the vitality of the POPs, whilst complying with regulations, stakeholder expectations, and safeguarding the intrinsic qualities of publicness. Whilst English law tends to operate against the publicness of space, and POPs are primarily regulated by private property rights, recourse to a binary legal understanding overlooks how publicness in practice possesses fluid and dynamic qualities, necessitating novel, pragmatic, and multi-dimensional approaches. The findings affirm the need to adopt a plural property lens, as publicness is viewed as a fluid concept even by the estate managers themselves. This approach helps anchor the realm where publicness and ownership meet, allowing us to revisit and critique the provision of public space in the contemporary neoliberal city context. So people on the ground, like the site managers, act as conduits or stewards between public and private interests, very much the way place managers, a town centre manager might do, focusing on these interstitial functions operating between formal property lines can reveal how the flow of publicness operates between rights, uses, and place hierarchies, carrying meaning from and for the public. So next slide, please. Yeah, okay. Well, okay. So while managers aspire to support lived publicness, their actions are constrained by material and market conditions. The outcomes of urban entrepreneurial strategies, often associated with privatised and exclusive spaces, are found to be rather localised and place contingent. The complex realities of these spaces and the external internal complexities stemming from legal dichotomies therefore need to be unpacked. Manchester's imminent long-term redevelopment plans pose significant challenge to the nuanced definitions of the public offering of POPs. So for instance, the Great Northern's public qualities are seen as much less significant in the proposed redevelopment of the site. So in this highly dynamic property development context, like central Manchester, the critique of POPs might be rendered rather mute due to their precarious nature. So this precarity and instability leads us to propose that durability should be considered as an additional dimension of publicness. By challenging meanwhile use, embedding durability aspires to the preservation of public space, public-facing aspects of POPs over time. And we feel this particularly significant in a city centre like Manchester, where access to any form of public space is at a premium. And durability might enable POPs to mature and connect with other parts of the urban fabric. Next slide, please. And this is all very timely, given the Empowerment Bill, which is currently under scrutiny by the UK Parliament, especially Clause 58, whereby local government will have a statutory responsibility to establish and support neighbourhood structures. However, the bill's terminology remains rather vague. Other than business improvement districts, there's a lack of guidance as to what these hyperlocal structures might look like. For example, in the shifting environment of POPs, a place-based partnership approach is required to develop the common understanding of minimum standards and localized approaches to safeguarding publicness. The managerial emphasis on safety and liability may be driven by a concern for protecting the owners from liability, but it illustrates how the public is often regarded as a potential litigant rather than a recipient of publicness. However, a place-based partnership approach can help move beyond this dynamic. and this would necessitate more input from the public and those who use these spaces. Now, we're not suggesting then that POPs are the answer, but given how partnership working is necessary to improve the public offering of POPs, there are insights which we can pull out, perhaps to inform the next phase of this hyperlocal governance in the UK. Next slide, please. The final takeaway, our focus has been on the hyperlocal, but POPs management connects to regional matters. Central Manchester is the symbolic downtown of a much larger urban system, a role it's performed since the 19th century. And there remains a prevailing sense Manchester is much bigger than it is, a city which spills out beyond its administrative borders to encompass surrounding jurisdictions. This grandeur is not just Manchester bravado, it's documented in formal planning over the decades. So Manchester evokes an extended civic pride, together with both economic and cultural leadership, where the city centre is the stage for public life across the region. The centre is therefore not just a local space, it's a regional emblem. The way POPs are managed here reflects and reinforces a regional identity, investment priorities, and public-private dynamics. Next slide. POPs are also shaped by overlapping relationships between property owners, local government authorities, and other civic groups, illustrating multi-scalar governance. The constellation of actors, landowners, bid managers, planners, cultural curators illustrates how regional governance is enacted through everyday spatial decisions. This work invites us then to rethink POPs not as isolated anomalies, but as microcosms of regional governance, where hyperlocal decisions reflect broader tensions around legitimacy, stewardship, and public value. So POPs governance, therefore, is entangled in a regional web of influence, and with over 70 in Manchester and London alone, they are becoming more visible and strategic attributes of regional economies. So the final slide, please. So this work reframes POPs not as problems to be solved, but as spaces of potential, where private actors can be nudged, supported, and inspired to act in the public interest. And our workshop was the first step, along with London's Public Space Charter and the knowledge exchange established by the POP managers in Manchester as a signs of momentum. Our study of POPs also speaks directly to a research agenda to help reconcile multi-scalar governance and place-based development. While POPs are managed hyperlocally, their dynamics, ownership, stewardship, and legitimacy are shaped by regional systems of planning, investment, and symbolic identity. Manchester city centre functions as a regional core, and the way POPs are governed here reflects these broader tensions around public values, spatial justice, and urban entrepreneurialism. In this sense, POPs are not just local anomalies, they are living regional artifacts, revealing how governance is enacted through everyday spatial decisions, grounding rarefied strategic visions through everyday management instruments. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And just before I introduce Dr. Lee for some sort of comments and sort of to help kick off the discussion, I'd encourage people, please do use the chat function, please do use the question and answer function, and we will sort of pose some questions to the panelists. But I would like to now introduce Dr. Lee, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Spatial Planning, Technical University of Dortmund in Germany. Her research explores public space governance and management, as well as co-production in planning. She has published several journal articles and the book on privately owned public spaces in the German and South Korean context. Currently, she is working on the management of public parks using social network analysis to study the actors involved, their networks, and how these networks influence the management of these spaces. So is the perfect sort of final speaker for us. So over to you, Dr. Lee.
So thank you for this interesting and important paper. I really appreciate your close engagement with the 3 POP sites in Manchester and how you go beyond the usual legal or spatial critique to explore the lived realities of publicness. I'd like to offer a few reflections that I hope will contribute to the discussion and suggest directions for further exploration. I'll share 5 main points. Firstly, I found your use of the plural property perspective particularly compelling. It offers a valuable way to move beyond the often oversimplified public-private divide that tends to dominate conversations around pubs. These spaces are frequently criticized, and often rightly so, due to their private ownership, which can lead to exclusion and control. But as your paper shows, the reality is much more complex than a simple public versus private binary. What stood out to me was your emphasis on publicness as fluid, negotiated, and continually shaped by different actors, rules, and everyday practices. This really resonates, and I think it opens up exciting possibilities for future research, not just on formal legal rights, but also on the informal norms, customs, and expectations that influence how pubs are actually used and experienced. Secondly, I strongly support your proposal to include durability as a key element of publicness. This is particularly relevant in a context where urban development is constantly shifting. In Germany, for instance, even when legal arrangements remain in place after a change in ownership, there is always the question of how long these arrangements can hold up, especially as conditions change. Contractual rules can become outdated or unfair and may need to be renegotiated. So if pubs are truly to serve the public, they need long-term guarantees. So here is a question I'd like to open up to the authors and the audience. Who is responsible for ensuring publicness of pubs over time? And what legal, financial, or social strategies could help secure the long-term durability of publicness in pubs, especially in the face of constant redevelopment pressure? Thirdly, I want to highlight your call for place-based collaboration, which I think is a very promising direction for the future of pubs. I strongly agree that this collaboration needs to go beyond public-private partnerships and actively involve the public. Citizens' everyday experiences, concerns, and local knowledge are vital for shaping spaces that are truly inclusive, responsive, and meaningful. But this brings us to a crucial question. What does meaningful citizen involvement actually look like in the context of pubs? And how can we move beyond superficial consultation and create models where public input actually influences how pubs are designed, managed, and maintained? Fourth, I welcome your focus on the often overlooked role of pubs managers. You rightly draw attention to their daily work, but I'd also suggest going further to look at their collaborative role. I believe by viewing managers not just as enforcers, but as potential connectors between different interests, we open the door to more dynamic, responsive forms of place management. This means exploring how managers collaborate or do not collaborate with one another, their relationships with local authorities and civil society actors, whether there are existing networks across developments for sharing best practices on issues like safety, inclusiveness, or programming. One comment in the paper that stood out to me was a manager expressing a desire to define the fundamentals of managing pubs and create a shared framework. This shows there is some appetite for collaboration and perhaps the start of a collective conversation among managers. So the question is, what would such a shared framework look like? And how might this collaborative capacity influence the delivery of publicness across different sites? Finally, I'd like to suggest one area for further research, a comparison of managers' roles and strategies across different types of ownership and management structures. This could include comparing between publicly and privately owned public spaces, and/or comparing spaces managed by public agencies, private firms, third sector organizations, or hybrid partnerships. Such a comparison could help us understand whether and how managerial values and priorities shift based on ownership and management structure, and how public involvement and accountability are structured differently, and what models seem to foster more durable, inclusive, or adoptable forms of publicness. So to conclude, overall, I think this paper makes a valuable contribution to current debates on public space in the neoliberal city. It reminds us that publicness is not a fixed legal category, but something that must be continually achieved, protected, and redefined. Through your grounded, thoughtful engagement with managers and everyday realities, the paper opens the door to a more nuanced and hopeful understanding of how publicness can be sustained, even under complex and challenging conditions. So thank you again for your important work.
And thank you, Dr. Lee, for sharing those sort of 5 points. And that's a perfect point. And I want to stop sharing my screen. And I'm hopeful that Jenny, Nikos, and Steve can sort of come back into the discussion. And I've got a couple of questions, but I would like to sort of go to the previous sort of speakers. And in any order, Steve, Jenny, or Nikos, hearing the 5 points from Dr. Lee there, is there anything that it prompts immediate thoughts that you would like to sort of respond to? And I will open that up to any of the previous panelists.
Thank you very much for your comments. They really resonate with what we are trying to achieve and what we will try to achieve in the future. And obviously, we will be happy to work with you in any of the points, particularly the last one you made, which is so interested about hybrid partnerships and comparison, also building on your own expertise and analysis, because these tools are so relevant in mapping and realizing exactly what nexus and connections are being made and how they affect how we experience and regulate these places. I would like, from my perspective, thank you very much for commenting on the need to adopt this plural property perspective. And I think that this can, as you said, resonate wider in the literature and help us bypass not just the private-public divide, but any sort of legal regulatory hurdle that we might stumble across. And with respect to the people's experience, this is particularly what guides our research, because as we have discussed in the office, one aspect of publicness as understood and experienced by the public itself has to do with the compartmentalization of the experience that doesn't give this uniform approach to living, visiting, and working in the city, particularly where we have a proliferation of privately owned public spaces, and the rules, regulations, and approaches that shape this experience might differ within a 5-minute walk from each other. So this is primarily the reason as citizens and our people who work in Manchester, what drives us to do this research is obviously our own experiences, our positionalities, which are valid as well, and which are also part of the paper. So the next stage would be to engage the public particularly, and also understand their experiences and what they feel they can or cannot do in any particular POP, particularly when we are discussing a small city centre the size of Manchester, where these experiences might vary from opposite ends of the same street, essentially. So this is a very important, a very valid take for our and point of deliberation for our research.
Thank you for that, Jenny. And Nikos, I might bring you in because there's a question in the chat function from Hamid, who sort of maybe building a little bit on from what sort of Jenny said. Have you sort of considered inclusion for some challenging users, such as young people, in sort of public and privately owned spaces? Is there any way that you could maybe take the research, sort of responding to Mohammed's point?
yeah, I mean, obviously this, this could be a bit tricky regarding, how we navigate the ethical approval, within our institution, and to include some of the challenging users. Mohammed is right. These challenges have been pinpointed in all the workshops that we attended during this project, and especially with regard to skateboarding or just loitering, protests as well,
homelessness,
vapes, of course. I mean, it's not really that much of a challenge, I guess, but it kind of shows that the inclusion, especially during protest time, and skateboarding, which is an obvious classic thing that people don't want to have. Sorry, I missed that question. Yeah, so how we can explore this potential for that? I think it's just maybe, with maybe deeper ethnography, really. I think that's probably the only tool that we may have in our ability. And so deeper ethnography, more observations, more participant observation in these spaces, like long-term observations of these areas, will probably give us that insight without being too obtrusive, I guess, to this challenging group of.
Yeah, well, I completely understand the sensitivities around points.
Steve has another perspective.
Steve did had something to say that we should turn into exclude groups more particularly.
Steve, would you like to come in? Because I've then probably got a follow-up question for you, picking up on one of your sort of slides. But if there's something you want to respond
to, because I've got a few things on the road going there.
Well, do you want to just respond to any of the comments from Dr. Lee or anything that Nikki and?
I'll take up Nikos's point of ethics. I've had assurances from the Associate Dean of the Institute of Children's Futures. We should tackle this. We cannot discursively exclude younger people from our research. It's becoming a major challenge. And I think it's our responsibility to take on these ethical challenges, which I think are thrown down as, if we're going to be critical of pop managers for protecting the legal rights of property owners, then we should take aim at universities as well, who are covering their own legal backsides. I think so. That's one point I want to come back on. So yes, we should do research on and with younger people. Importantly, I think also, secondly, though, I think we were able to get a lot of hidden depth into the paper, and there is a lot of positive engagement work going on through the POP sites and the various people involved in their management and operation, some of which goes under the radar because it's not publicized, and we didn't want to draw attention to it because they didn't want us to draw attention to it. So that was part of the bargain. But there is a greater depth in there. And one challenge POP managers refer to is that in a context like Britain, where services have been withdrawn to support mental health, where services have been withdrawn around all sorts of social support, the POP managers are finding themselves at the front line of this in the absence of state responses. So they're having to come up with surprisingly proactive strategies through which to manage social problems. And it's not within their remit to do. And the easiest option is to just move them off site so that's someone else's problem. That's actually not happening. It's actually bad for business and profile and for all sorts of reasons. So there's all these hidden bits which I think would feed into future research. I think is really interesting terrain. And that really speaks to Dahae's points about what are these mechanisms? How do they go forward? And I think, and my honest answer to this is I don't know. Because there's a real absence in Britain of neighbourhood governance. We eradicated it decades ago, and now the country's been challenged to reinstate it. And my concern, I think the concern of the Institute, is that skills and capacity to do this kind of inclusive place management at the hyperlocal level does not exist. And we need to retool the governance system in order to equip them with the mechanisms to engage communities and businesses and so on. But that's also a two-way street, because that kind of engagement requires proactive engagement from businesses, users. They need to get involved in these kind of discussions. So it's establishing, I think, all we can do is create these spaces of dialogue for interchange and knowledge exchange, and equip people with skills, training, and knowledge, and do, you know, put our hand out to guide. But the doing is you know, that's a big challenge, I think, and it's this fertile terrain to be explored. And what does inclusive and effective, and I put that in there importantly, because the worry is we're just about to create thousands and thousands of local talking shops, and we don't need that either.
I can see that you're passionate about this, Steve, and I know full well you are. But sort of a question for you, Steve, if sort of like in a minute or so, and then one back to sort of Jenny. So how do you see the research influencing the current sort of devolution discussion? Sort of what you've got, if MPs were looking, what is the one thing your research should be saying to sort of parliamentary makers? And then maybe for sort of Jenny, and maybe for yourselves, IPM and MAMET recently hosted a delegation of sort of individuals from the State Assembly in Nigeria. I know, Steve, you're off to Finland, I think, in the new year to talk about this. Where do you see you taking your research? So the first one, sort of, Steve, to you, how do you want to influence policy with the research? And then where are you taking this sort of the research wider?
I'm glad this session has been recorded, because I'm actually going to say, I think the Empowerment Bill and the pride in place policies enacted by the UK government are actually really good things in principle. I'm actually, you know, I'm not going to sit here in a reactionary academic way and go, well, you know, it could do this, it could do that, it could do this. I think the principles are there. But with all legislation, the devil's in the detail. And I think, so when the Empowerment Bill refers to neighbourhood structures, that is a get out clause, isn't it? I mean, it's a kind of like, well, what does that look like? And as I said in the presentation, the only legal mechanism we have outside of local government is a business improvement district, and they're not feasible in most locations. So there's a real challenge there. But absolutely, we do need to address this problem, because people, ordinary people, are crying out for control over their own destinies. They want to get involved in determining what happens to their place. And they're turning to populist politicians as a consequence. And that will be, I think, will be negative for a lot of people. So we absolutely have to engage in these debates. And we absolutely
speaks to Dr. Lee's point,
yes,
as well. Sort of mindful of the time, we've just got sort of a couple of minutes left. I would just like to bring Nikos and sort of Jenny in, just sort of picking up. Yes, we hosted a delegation from the Nigerian State Assembly. Sort of Steve is off to sort of Finland. Where do you want to take sort of the research over the next sort of couple of years in the next 2 minutes that we've got?
I mean, sure, yeah. And, you know, just to bring back Dahae's comments on, you know, what does meaningful citizen involvement looks like in this context, or, you know, how we can, you know, save these places with the public's, you know, view. I think it's important to learn from other, you know, what happens in other countries. And Dahae's work, for example, in, you know, in the German context, the South Korean context is very important in that. And, you know, we need, and, you know, the research has been quite Western, you know, in general. So, you know, if there is a possibility to do something similar and learn that from other parts of the world, that would be useful, and see how these spaces are being, you know, are being managed, and how they're actually used, you know, in the everyday context. And so I think. Yeah, if Jenny wants to add something.
And I want to address Mohammed's follow-up comment on incentivize specific use or activities for challenging users. If you ask a legal scholar, it would be not to prosecute them. So we start by ensuring that they are involved in all decision-making processes, and then they're not necessarily faced with this exclusionary proposition, like potential infringers or potential abusers. So the important thing is to navigate from the exclusion of place, particularly in the UK, we're talking about public order protection orders, to move into a more consultation model to the extent that this would be possible. Again, we're going back to the drawing board or including all stakeholders, also potentially taking advantage of the bill, as Steve said, that's coming up, and literally going back to envisioning altogether, which might sound romantic, but we are led there. And now with the devolution bill, potentially we are getting there with some backing from government to how we can all be included in the same conversation.
Let's all be included in the same conversation. That's a brilliant way of sort of ending the session. I think Nikos was saying about learning from sort of more global knowledge exchange. So if there's people on the call from different countries across the world, please do connect with Nikos, with Jenny, with Steve, who are probably really keen to sort of explore further research with you. I just want to sort of finish by thanking you all. Special thanks to Dr. Lee for joining us and giving her perspectives. Thank you to all the attendees for sort of coming on the call today and participating in the discussion. Thank you to the RSA. Thank you to all my IPM colleagues. This is the first of what is a series of events. I believe the next one is December the 4th, and we will be talking the evolution, picking up very much the conversation that we've had today. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next IPM and RSA webinar. All the best. Cheerio. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.